So now we're going to introduce our first speaker of the day. His name is Callum Butts, and he's the Director of Charitable Operations at AT&T and a key partner in the movement to improve high school graduation rates. We're thrilled to hear from him today, so welcome, Callum.
Thank you. Welcome to the first ever virtual Building a GradNation report event, featuring progress and challenges in boosting high school graduation rates. As Liz said, I'm Callum Butts. I'm Director of Charitable Operations for AT&T. And AT&T is proud of to have been the lead sponsor of the annual update to the nation over the last decade or so through our Aspire initiative. For more than a dozen years, AT&T Aspire has helped provide access to education and training people need to get and keep good jobs. This is an important year for Building a GradNation, not only because it marks the 10th anniversary of the GradNation campaign, but also because of the critical time we're facing in the country. Some just call it 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic has altered education in unprecedented ways, and schools and districts are still grappling to find the most effective way to teach students safely and with quality. Additionally, protests in response to systemic racism in our nation's institutions demand an overdue response to inequity in our education system. Increases in the graduation rate have been driven by students of color over the past 10 years, and there's been good progress in translating those gains into enrollment in post-secondary institutions. But large gaps still remain between achievement and graduation rates between students of color and their white peers before the pandemic started. The data presented today from this year's report is the latest that we have, and it's from 2018. It'll serve as an important baseline for years to come as we analyze the impacts of COVID-19 on the entire school-to-work pipeline. Today, we're lucky to hear the perspectives of young people and former U.S. Secretaries of Education during this challenging time. I'm also excited to announce this year's report includes the new Meeting the Moment plan. This plan focuses on the smallest subset of states, districts, and high schools in which the 90% graduation rate goal could realistically be met if the number of non-graduates were cut in half. Every state's strengths and weaknesses are unique, which means solutions to raising their high school graduation rates must be approached as such and grounded in data-driven evidence. You've probably heard that before. We hope that this event leaves you informed to the challenges of reaching the GradNation's campaign goal of a 90% graduation rate by the class of 2020, but also hopeful about the great progress that has been made so far and will be made in the future as we work together to put students' needs first. I want to thank our partners on the GradNation campaign, Civic, the Everyone Graduates Center at Johns Hopkins University, America's Promise Alliance, and the Alliance for Excellent Education, together with the many other partners who are part of this effort. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Bob Balfanz, author with Civic of Building GradNation from the Everyone Graduates Center at Johns Hopkins, to present the report's data and the new Meeting the Moment plan. Bob, off to you.
Thank you, Callum.
Yep.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bob Balfanz, and I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about how we can continue to build a GradNation during and post-COVID, and what the data says about how we can do that. So if we go to the next slide, the good news is, as Callum pointed out, is that pre-COVID, graduation rates were continuing to rise. Most recent data from 2018 shows the rate at 85%, an all-time high, and sort of a continuation of the slow, steady progress over the past few years. But maybe the real story is if we look at the whole trend from about 2003, we can see we've made big progress as a nation from 72% to 85%. With that, and the most important thing about that is it tells us that 3.8 million, nearly 4 million more students graduated over that time than would not have if our grad rates had stayed flat as they had been flat for the prior 30 years. So that's a lot of lives changed for the better in a relatively short period of time. And as Callum pointed out in our next slide, these gains were really driven by improvements among minority and low-income students. And even from just 2011, we've seen fairly significant progress. Black rates have gone up 12 points, Hispanic rates 10, low-income students about 10, students with disabilities about 8. And what that means, again, as sort of a pre-COVID baseline, is that, you know, by 2019, right, when COVID hit, really for the first time in our nation's history, both students of color and low-income students had an 80% graduation rate. Now, on one hand, that's a sorry statistic, right? That it's still 80%, right? That's not sufficient at all. But on the other hand, it represents real progress from the high 60s, where it was less than a decade ago. Next slide, please. But even with this progress, some of our most vulnerable students still ended pre-COVID with really low graduation rates. Homeless students, 67%, English language learners, 68%, students with disabilities, 67%. And in fact, a quarter of remaining students who are falling off track in high school are now students with disabilities. So a lot of work to go with our most vulnerable students. And as we can see, and as we know in our next slide, the challenge we face is the very groups that are making progress and the very groups that continue to struggle are those that are being most impacted by COVID-19 and the continuing structural and systematic racism, right? We know a greater percentage of Black and Latino students are learning remotely. We know that low-income students are having to take time off of school to work to support their family or help their younger siblings. We know students with disabilities are not getting their full services. We know that connectivity and device challenges impact low-income and minority students more. And we also know that low-income and first-generation students really count on the in-school supports they get from counselors and nonprofits. And for those that have, ended remotely and started remotely, it's been a long period of time when those crucial supports have not been available. So, if we go to the next slide, what does this tell us about how we can keep raising graduation rates and college readiness rates during and after COVID? A couple of key facts in the data. Next slide. First, just by the numbers, we would need 100 from our pre-COVID baseline. We would need about 175,000 more graduates to reach 90. But that's not really the key number, because to reach 90 with equity, which is what we really must do, we need about 64,000 more Black students graduating, another 83,000 Hispanic students, and 103 students with disabilities. But when you think about that, each of those is a football stadium. That's a manageable number. We can visualize it. Just a football stadium more of each, and we will have made tremendous progress for them and for our nation, right? So the challenge is real, but the numbers are manageable. Next slide. And as Kellen was pointing out, one thing we have to really factor in is that as we think about what our efforts are now to really meet the moment and sort of keep going forward, is that there's been some change in the dynamics since we first started trying to raise graduation rates a decade ago with the GradNation campaign and even a decade before that. And that right now, each state is a different story. They've had different rates of growth, taken different strategies to get there. They have different remaining challenges. They have different groups of students in need of additional supports and resources. And even their students that are falling off track are doing it in different types of schools. In some states, most students are still falling off track in traditional neighborhood high schools. In other states, most of them are in alternative schools. In some states, many of the schools that are struggling are charter schools. In others, that's not the case. So we really have to take our data, much of which is in this report, in a lot of detail in the appendix, and our understanding of COVID impacts as they vary by states, to create real state-by-state strategies to meet the moment and keep progress going. Next slide. And in that, the magnitude of the challenge also varies by states. There's 15 states that are within 1,000 more graduates of 90%. That's just a little more attention and you're there, right? But there's 5 states that really have over 10,000 more graduates to go. Ohio, Georgia, Michigan, New York, California, which speaks to more systematic and more intensive efforts in a greater number of places. Next slide. And as I was beginning to say, another key thing we have to think about and understand how the environment has changed is the characteristics of low graduation high schools are changing. When we first started addressing this is a big collective in our nation decade or more ago, most students were falling off track and dropping out from regular neighborhood high schools. And we were able to show there was about 2,000 of those drove half the problem. And since that time, that number has been reduced in half. And the percent of students attending those schools has been cut even more. But we look at the schools that remain, where progress is still needed and support is still needed and innovative solutions are required, we can see that almost half those schools that are low graduation rate are no longer regular schools. They're alternative schools, they're vocational schools, they're special ed schools. And they're not all neighborhood district schools anymore, right? 31% of the remaining low graduation rate high schools are charter schools. And 10% are virtual schools. And that number there of 214 should give us real pause as we think about what's happening under COVID-19 and remote learning, right? There are pre-COVID, there were 214 virtual high schools with low graduation rates, right? So that should just be, I think, a flashing yellow light for what may happen and what we have to think about and be ready for it to provide supports for. Next slide. The next key point is that a lot of the remaining challenge is incredibly concentrated in a relatively few places. And at some level, this is really the result of 100 years of sort of segregation, disinvestment, and discrimination, where we have created a subset of districts that have not had the opportunity and the resources and the investment and the supports to succeed. So we can find half of the remaining students falling off track across the whole nation in just 4% of our school districts, which is 434, right? There is over 12,000 school districts, right? This is 434 of them have half the kids that are falling off track. For Black students, it's 150 school districts. For Hispanic, 173. We can look at students of color, and we're 250 districts, have half of them of the nation's students falling off track. The final thing that we're not showing here that we have to keep in our plans to solve this is that while half of the problem is super concentrated, the other half is highly diffuse. So 1/3 of students who are falling off track are spread across 10,000 school districts, right? It's 10 here, it's 5 here, it's 20 there. So we have to have plans and responses that can both deal with sort of hyper concentration and wide dispersion. Next slide. So as we were thinking about, how to approach this, one of the questions we were asked and answered in the report is what is the shortest path to 90% with equity? What is the fewest number of places that would have to reduce their number of non-graduates or off-track students in half across all subgroups to get us to 90% with equity? And the answer is if we reduce half our non-graduates in 22 states, within those 22 states, 425 school districts and 887 high schools, we're at the 90% goal. And a thing to remember about this 90% goal, this is a 90% goal for students graduating on time. We know there's about 5% or more kids that graduate with extra years. So that means actually a real graduation rate of 95% is the goal. And those remaining 5% of kids, we will keep working until we get all of them too. But if we can get to the 90 and the 95, that will be a tremendous step forward for the students and the nation. So how can we do it, right? In my last minutes, how can we pivot out of COVID and get through COVID, take the data we have about baseline, understanding the concentration and the dispersion, that each state is a different story. How do we create a meeting the moment plan that gets the job done? So what we're proposing on our report is 7 key elements, right? Obviously, we need a national response to COVID-19. We have to improve the whole system of education, find ways to have it end up starting better than where we left it. And just the one thing we're highlighting here is that it's clear from a lot of what we're learning on the ground is that has to include sort of an integrated approach to social, emotional, academic development. The idea that learning is social, emotional. And we can see it with vivid evidence now as our students and teachers struggle to teach under COVID, that we have to really just begin with that as a foundation. We're gonna need customized state plans, right? That each state is a different story. We're going to each state to have a real database plan based on their pre-COVID data. And again, there's a rich set to start from in the report and the appendixes, and their COVID-19 impact, because that's going to vary by place. And putting those things together, we need these state level plans on how to keep raising graduation rates and college and career readiness rates together to reach our goals. We're going to need to spread on-track and early warning systems to progress monitor all students with predictive indicators against both high school graduation outcomes and college and career readiness outcomes, and combine that with multi-tiered support systems. A lot of evidence that the places that made progress to date are the places that invested in those, but there's still a lot of places to spread them and grow them and expand them to be both not just high school graduation, but also college and career readiness. Next slide. We're going to need more person power. We're going to need to close relationship and support gaps. Think about those places, those districts, those 434 districts where half the kids are falling off track. In those districts and in those schools, almost every student needs additional supports. Our schools are not designed for that. We need to partner with other groups, other partnerships, get more person power to provide school success coaching, right? Helping them get their work done, get through school, get to school, problem solve, prepare them for the future. And AmeriCorps is the place to do that. It's an established program. It has infrastructure. There's bills in Congress to expand it. We need to pass it, get it done, and increase the person power so every student can have a success coach and tight relationships and customized support. We're going to need structures and funds to support enhanced teacher, school leader collaboration, professional learning, continuous improvement, high school redesign, community partners, and family involvement. Those are all things that have shown their mettle during COVID. And the work we've done with many schools and others, we can see that schools that had those things ahead of time are doing much better navigating the shoals of COVID and being adaptive and figuring ways forwards. And places that were primarily relied on structures and systems often prove to be quite brittle. So we really have to invest in what evidence says works and make sure that it gets to the places that need it. And finally, and almost foremost, we really have to align our high school graduation requirements with the admission criteria of state university systems, including flagships and workforce prep. This might seem obvious, but actually pre-COVID, very few states was it the case that if you graduate from high school, you were automatically had the preparation needed to apply to the state university system, and including the flagship. And this is one of the ways we perpetuate inequities and continue sort of elements of structural and systematic racism by not having it be that by graduating high school, you are de facto ready to apply for the state university system and be ready for the workforce. The big opportunity we have here is during COVID, almost all states waived most of their graduation requirements within a period of 10 days. These were things that were hard fought, debated, back and forth for a decade before. But when push comes to shove, people realized maybe this isn't quite as important as we thought it was. So we can start anew. We can make it data driven. We can actually follow kids over time. We now have state longitudinal data systems to do that, to figure what really matters for preparation in high school to signal you're ready for the workforce and for college and young adult success. Because so many of our criteria before were based on our best guesses and our intuitions. And we can really now have an opportunity to both make it data-based, but to make it universal. So when you graduate from high school, you are de facto ready and able to apply to the state university system. So with that, we're gonna get to hear from some kids. And I'm gonna now turn it over to Ty Swanson, a special education teacher from Enloe Magnet High School in North Carolina. And he'll be leading a student panel discussion focusing on their high school experiences and their thoughts on the future. Ty, it's all yours.
Thank you. Welcome everyone to our first panel of the day. As we know, young people are facing unprecedented difficulties as a result of the COVID-19. According to a nationally representative survey of more than 3,000 high school students, that Alliance, America Promise Alliance, conducted this past spring, more than 1 in 4 young person reported feeling unhappy, feeling depressed, or even losing sleep because of worry. With the increasing severity of the COVID-19 pandemic this summer, that figure has only likely risen. While the pandemic has forced a shift in educational practices across the country, students are also seeing firsthand the effects of systemic racism in schools and in their daily lives. For example, while most students attend schools where the graduation rate is already 90%, the Building a GradNation report released today shows that a disproportionate number of Black and Hispanic students, students of low-income families, and students that experience homelessness attend a low graduation rate high school, where the average graduation rate is 42%. So we've gathered a panel of young people from across the country to hear their perspectives on education. First, I would like to introduce Jack, followed by Ash. Jack?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jack. I am 17. I'm from Colorado. I go to Peak to Peak Charter School. I'm gay and I have ADHD, and I'm here with Eye to Eye National, which is a nonprofit aimed towards unlocking greatness and the 1 in 5 that learn differently.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ash. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona, but I am here in New York at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute studying industrial engineering. And I'm here with Schoolhouse Connections as a unaccompanied homeless youth, which is an organization / nonprofit that helps for helping homeless youth go to post-secondary education and thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack and Ash. So let's dive into our first question. We know that schooling has changed significantly this fall in response to the pandemic. We've seen that schools and districts are making very difficult decisions about in-person learning versus online learning. How has your school responded to learning in the COVID-19? Jack?
Yeah, so learning in the COVID times has definitely been tricky. Back in March, when COVID started to come around, my school moved all virtual, as did most. And what my school did is they would put out weekly plans of all asynchronous work, things that we would have to do by ourselves, all self-directed, which was really difficult, especially somebody who has learning differences. I struggled a lot by, managing my time, feeling self-directed. So that was really tricky. And not being able to see my peers and connect with my teachers, that is something that I really valued in in-person school. So my school adjusted. They took in a lot of feedback about how the last bit of spring went, and they completely redirected how the school was going to go. So this fall, we have now adopted the quarter system so that students will have less classes that they're responsible for in one period of time, which ultimately decreases the amount of time that I have to spend on the computer, which has been really convenient. And then my classes, all of my classes have synchronous time. So we have time to meet in a Zoom type setting to kind of go over, whatever topic it is. And then we have time built in to do our homework and come to the next class prepared with whatever content. So what about you, Ash?
Thank you, Jack. The college experience has transitioned from what was once all in person to heavily social distance or completely virtual. Learning has been completely different in that sense, as I raise my hand by clicking a button or spend more time trying to figure out why my audio isn't working rather than what the material of the classroom is. Not only are the social components very isolating, but so has learning, as I can't ask my professor / TA for help on a problem after class without getting lost in WebEx links, let alone meeting my peers at the same age as me to lean on for support. Overall, I have not been too fond of the new approach for learning, but I understand that this is a new journey for all of us, as I see professors struggling as well with Zoom, just as much as me.
Thank you, Ash. And I just want to say that not only are professors struggling, teachers are struggling with this as well, because this is something that none of us have ever experienced. And I believe that we are all in this together, as I've been telling my students since we began remote learning, is that this is a journey that we're all in together, and it's going to take all of us to rely on each other's strength and expertise to make sure that our learning process is still continuing. So we'll move right into the next question. So Yes. While we know these times have been challenging, we also know that schools and districts have been more innovative in how they support students. Are there any things that are working for you all? And if so, what are those things, and what are those things, excuse me, and how would you like to see those continued in the future? Ash, let's start with you.
Perfect. I would like to say that this is a wonderful example of me leaning on my professors for support. But a way that my teachers have made my college experience better is by making a class norm to have breaks, whether that's from sitting too long or from the lectures, or even just stop talking about the content and discussing something lighthearted to feel more of a human connection, as well as having a moment of what feels like fresh air. And then a way that I've made it better for my situation that I hope to see in the future is to be very reactive within my Zoom and online calls, creating a fun and exciting time to be connected to my peers as well as my professors, but to also have a sense of importance in attending my college classes. Would you like to say anything, Jack?
Yeah, there have been multiple things that have been going pretty well for me. But like I mentioned earlier, I'm here with Eye to Eye, which is a national nonprofit that works with students with learning differences. And Eye to Eye has been a partner of America's Promise. They've been in the Alliance for quite a while now. But in Eye to Eye, what we kind of do is we mentor middle school students that have learning differences and that are similarly labeled. And the entire Eye to Eye curriculum it's an art-based curriculum that talks about all of the different social emotional learning skills that are needed. You know, that ranges from grit to self-advocacy to setting goals to accommodating for yourself, and so many other things that are so important for students that learn differently. And I think that with the COVID times, the need for social emotional learning has only amplified, not just for students with learning differences, but for every student. I know that if I'm not able to complete something or do my best in the time frame given, like, it's very important for me to be able to advocate for myself and to be able to speak up and talk about what I need from my teacher. And it's a little bit easier to do that in person, and we're not able to get that sort of support in a virtual setting. So, and everybody, I feel like all of my, it's hard, when you're in school and everybody's stressed about things, and you have your peers to lean on and to talk to each other about, like, what's going on in school and life. And it's really hard to do that from a distance setting. So one of the ways that I've had a lot of successes with my psychology teacher, Carla Flanhofer. What she does at the beginning of all of her Zoom meetings is having us put something that we're grateful for in the chat. And then she has us fill out a Google form that has us rate how we're doing from 1 to 10, and then kind of give us a brief, gives us a time to kind of explain the things that are going on in our lives, to be able to better connect with, her as a teacher, which has been really nice, and a really good way to connect and kind of help, the transition between online and, like, in person and online. And also being really innovative in how she teaches. In psychology, it's all these terms about, like, how we think and behave. And she teaches the entire class doing through simulations, which, takes its various forms. It could either be like watching a video and then filling out a form, or, seeing how different things impact us. So having that really engaging teaching style instead of just a lecture where students are obviously going to be dozing off has been really, really amazing, and really just, I would say, pivotal to my success in these COVID times. So.
Thank you, Jack and Ash. And the most important piece I think you both hit on was the social emotional learning, which is something that I have to make sure that I am constantly keeping in the forefront of my mind as it relates to my students. Because learning is one thing, but taking care of the students and seeing their whole self is the most important piece. And I think that the check-ins which are needed are ways to help teachers get a gauge of the room, a different form of a temperature check. So those are definitely needed. And I hope that social emotional learning will continue to be pushed through our curriculums as we transition back to our new normal or whatever that may look like. So I'm going to switch gears here to another topic that might be a little challenging. So this summer, we saw young people leading movements and joining uprisings against police violence and more broadly systemic racism. Many of these inequities that were called out during these movements are parallel in the education system. How do you think systemic racism has impacted your own educational experience? Jack?
Yeah, so I think that it's really important for me to first address that I go to a successful charter school, and I do understand that I have a lot of privilege, and I have been really privileged in my education, which I'm very grateful for, but I'm also an ally of creating equity where it's needed. So my school personally, I have not been impacted by systemic racism, but my school has done nothing short but teaching us about all of the inequities that exist in our world, in our contemporary world. So, besides having a whole lens on equity and trying to incorporate equity into all of our different curriculum, that is something that my school takes very seriously. But to give you some specific examples, last year I took a class called AP Humanities, which is a combined course of AP US History and AP Lang, which was also taught by my wonderful psychology teacher this year, Ms. Flanhofer. And we had a whole unit on race and culture. And during that, learning about the different types of oppression, the four eyes of oppression, and all of these different components that make up race relations in our contemporary world and how it's been, gone through, the entire history of it. And having my teacher being really aware of her identity as a white woman and, bringing in speakers, we had the Native American Rights Fund come in to talk to us about some of the inequities that they may face. We had hijabi women come in and share their experiences. We learned all about all the different African American culture. We took so many different field trips to, different places in our own region that kind of highlight and emphasize race relations. So that having those components all throughout my, my class and my teaching, having those ideas taught to me, really challenged me in almost every aspect of my learning and my life. I mean, there were, you learn that you have these biases that you don't even, they're implicit, and, we have to work to address them. And I think that my school did a really amazing job at handling that and telling me that, these conversations are going to be held forever in our contemporary world, and especially at the collegiate level, is something that I've been aware of and something that, I need to keep talking about. So, yeah, I think that it's been really good. How about you, Ash?
Thank you, Jack. So I would like to say that my high school and college has been very supportive in these empowering movements for social injustice in both Arizona and in New York, having many class discussions about it and overall facilitating many ways to be supportive as a community. On a side note, outside of the classroom, having a background within homelessness, it's very important for me to have a sense of belonging within my education, within my school's community. So I believe it's very important for those in the educational system to be supportive of minorities who have a higher rate of experiencing struggles like homelessness, mental health issues, or other issues within poverty without the students having to aggressively search for help. So being Hispanic from Arizona, moving 2,000 miles away from home while being homeless, it was a culture shock to not see anyone like me or talk like me or even feel an ounce of what I feel. While being a woman in STEM, this isolating time was very stacked, and yet I'm still a white woman in America who has a lot of privilege. So I still do not feel the full force of this time. And so that's my perspective on this answer as well. So thank you.
Thank you guys for sharing your perspective. And systemic racism is a very challenging conversation to have. And I do believe that it takes all of us in this. And one thing that I'm confident in is if we provide our students with spaces to have these discussions and to lead these discussions, I believe with everything in me that we will come up with tangible solutions together, because you guys are not only our future, but you're also our generation of now. And so it's very important that you guys lead the way and show us, you know, what we can and cannot do. And so I'm very confident with the work that's going on. So let's dive into another direction. And this one is dealing with college prep. So can you guys talk about your post-secondary preparation you've received at your school? Do you feel that schools are preparing you to go on to college? Jack, we will start with you, followed by Ash. Jack.
Wonderful. And I think that our third panelist joined too, so maybe we can get him in here and get him to talk a little bit. But I go to a college prep school, like I said, so I have been really blessed with being prepared, you know, to talk about, you know, post-secondary education and kind of to really prepare me. So what my school has personally done in regards to like career education and career planning, we have had career meetings and career lessons since I was in 6th or 7th grade. We would get on to different websites and, you know, have little research projects about like what we could see ourselves being in the future and, you know, what steps do we need to take to get there. And then in high school, we've had meetings about college and college prep, you know, throughout my entire high school career. We have counselors, college counselors come in, talk to us about, you know, what do we need to do for the college process? Like, what should we be doing now? And now that I'm a senior, having that support and having that foundational knowledge about post-secondary education, what I need to do to get there, has been really amazing, especially having such a small school environment. And having like, you know, I know that at some public high schools, your college advisor is also advising 600 other students. And it's hard to get like that personal connection and like personal help. So I've been really blessed to have such a small, tight-knit community where I can get the help that I need. And in regards to like my classes and being academically prepared for college, I feel like I have been more than prepared. My school is really rigorous and has been really pushing the idea that like the things that we're doing in class now, you're going to be utilizing at the collegiate level, and really understanding that all of the work that we're doing now is really the groundwork so that you can succeed later. You know, that comes in writing research papers and developing my writing style and, you know, learning how to write, or, you know, just being able to manage my time, which is, you know, something that I, as someone who has an LD learning difference, is, you know, that's a big struggle. So trying to come to terms with those and planning out my whole life, and planning out even a semester by using a syllabus has been something that I've learned pretty well at my school. So yeah, what about you, Ash? I know that you're in college, so I'd love to hear about how, like you felt prepared in high school and how that's playing out now that you are in college.
Yes, I'm so excited to talk about this. So my high school was just awarded a National Blue Ribbon. So my high school was very wonderful at post-secondary preparation, as I had a built-in path to internships, college fairs, fly-ins, summer involvement programs across the nation, and overall preparing me for my next steps. By the time I graduated, I had completed 2 internships, was on my way to 2 more internships, completed a few fly-ins, and overall had several interviews with many individuals for my desired profession. So I had an amazing perspective on college, as well as other paths like military, working directly after high school, as well as college. And so my high school had a wonderful way of showing me different perspectives on what my next steps were without holding any stigmas towards any of the options provided. And because of my high school's past, I know for a fact that I had a strong idea of what I wanted to do after high school, as well as a strong idea of what I will be doing after college for my career at this point. So, yep.
Well, thank you, Jack and Ash, for sharing your perspectives about the issues that we're facing in education, as well as the promises of the future. I do want to mention that our third panelist was on, but he was having a medical emergency, and so we're going to keep him lifted up in our thoughts. And so I am inspired by you guys. This is the reason why I decided to become a teacher, to make a difference. And you guys are teaching me, which is, you know, the best gift that anyone can have. I think we should all be life learners. So now that you've heard from several people, several of our youth, about their current experiences, we would like to introduce you to John Bridgeland, the CEO of Civic, who will be facilitating a conversation with three of our former Secretaries of Education. I'll let Bridge do more of the introductions, and I'll turn over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tyler, and to Ash and to Jack for the wonderful presentation. I loved how you interacted with one another. It just reminded me that, you know, it was really the perspective and the power of the voices of young people who in the first place catapulted the dropout epidemic to the national stage and gave us all hope that regardless of students who are experiencing homelessness or students with learning disabilities or students growing up with traumatic experiences, that this was something the nation could do something about and unleash all this wonderful potential. I also want to thank our partners at America's Promise Alliance and Johns Hopkins, the Alliance for Excellent Education, and AT&T and Pure Edge for the extraordinary partnership over 15 years. So welcome to my three of my favorite people. You're all looking very well in the time of COVID. And just wanted to say that, you know, efforts to boost high school graduation rates and to end the dropout crisis occurred during the terms of these three extraordinary U.S. Secretaries of Education. Margaret Spellings, my dear friend under President George W. Bush, and my dear friends Arnie Duncan and John King under President Obama. From No Child Left Behind and the common calculation of graduation rates among all the governors, and then by the administration to the Race to the Top Innovative Initiative, to the Every Student Succeeds Act. These secretaries really showed such strong leadership and engaged their presidents, President Bush and President Obama, to make it a priority to boost outcomes for children and youth. And as Bob Balfanz mentioned earlier, they got results. More than 3.5 million students graduated rather than dropping out during these two administrations, with students of color driving the gains and also doubling their post-secondary enrollment. So the COVID-19 pandemic and protests over systemic racism have come thundering onto the national stage, further cracking open educational inequities and creating even greater challenges with remote and hybrid learning. And we'll discuss all this and more today. So let's jump right in. First question for the three of you. You've all been instrumental over so many years in the GradNation campaign and in helping to drive these dramatic increases in graduation rates and accountability efforts, including a focus on the remaining low-performing high schools, where remarkably graduation rates are just 41%. And this year's report included the Meeting the Moment plan with a targeted path toward reaching a 90% grad rate, as Bob mentioned, with both quality and equity. So will you take a moment, and Margaret, let's start with you first, to reflect on what you think really mattered in progress to date, see as essential in terms of moving the campaign into its next act, including the role for the U.S. Department of Education. So Margaret?
Okay, Bridge, well, thank you for your leadership on this over the many years. I'll never forget you coming to my office when I was the secretary. Obviously, we were close colleagues at the White House together and launching all of this. And I think, you know, before we can get into the discussion, it's important that we reflect on where we were in the early 2000s. You know, we had maybe 32 or so states participating in the NAEP, not the same 32 every administration. That was moving target. Annual assessment was not ubiquitous. We didn't know as much as we should and do now about how our students are doing. And certainly we hadn't alighted around, you know, common definitions and expectations that were national in aspiration and understanding and elevating the importance of high school graduation. And I think one of the things that's been so important about this work is people get that. Unlike, the need for 8th grade algebra or even 3rd grade reading or teacher quality or whatever, people understand, man, you got to get out of high school if you're going to go anywhere in this country. And so I think, our most important contribution was that common definition, making this an imperative. And then Arnie and John really took it to the next level in terms of identifying the dropout factories, if you will, and working the problem. And so that would be my opening comment on, I guess we'll get into kind of where we are now and where we're headed, but that's my quick look back.
So wonderful, Margaret, and thanks for all your, your leadership and contributions. And you regularly showed up to the GradNation summits, and we have Mrs. Bush, and of course, Arnie, if you could reflect on, what have we learned from the progress that's been made, and what does that tell us about the road ahead?
Well, first, I just, want to thank you for your leadership. Bob Balfanz has been obviously extraordinary, your partner in this work. And this is, there are many unbelievably nonpartisan and bipartisan issues. I would put this right at the top of the list. And just to have your leadership, Margaret's leadership, John and I tried to follow in your footsteps as best we could. But I don't know who in our country benefits from more high school dropouts. And, just historically, I'll say, when I grew up on the south side of Chicago, some of my friends dropped out of high school, and it wasn't great, but it wasn't the end of the world, frankly. They could go work in the stockyards, the steel mills, and buy a home and support a family, and they could do okay. And we all know those jobs are gone. They're never coming back. And what I say all the time is if you drop out of high school now, you're basically condemned to poverty and social failure. Like, you have to graduate from high school. Frankly, a high school diploma is not enough. Some form of post-secondary, 4-year, 2-year, trade school, community college, military, whatever, some form of education beyond that. But so we're fighting, this isn't about education. This is really fighting for people's lives, just to give them a chance to make it in society, to contribute. So I'll say, two things are really helpful for me. Before I got to DC, working in Chicago, the consortium on Chicago School Research out of the University of Chicago, John Easton, did independent research on us. And they came back one year, we were celebrating the progress we were making. And they came back and talked about how critically important freshmen on track were. It was absolutely predictive of eventually graduating from high school. Now that sounds sort of common sense now, but at the time we didn't realize that. And we put a tremendous amount of resources into that bridge between 8th grade and 9th grade, making sure kids didn't fall through the cracks. We made sure every freshman in high school had an adult who was checking on them, not waiting to the end of the semester, but if they missed a day of school, we're on them. And we were able to start to significantly bump up graduation rates. What's been so fun to me was to see Chicago continue that trend. And it's been like 15 or 17 years straight of increasing high school graduation rates. But it's informed by data. It's informed by, by the evidence. What you guys did, and my numbers won't be exact, but what I remember was something like 2,000 high schools were producing about half the nation's dropouts. It was a staggeringly high percent at a relatively small percent of the problem. We have 100,000 schools in America, 2,000 high schools producing half the dropouts, and about 75% from the minority community, our Black and brown students. And so to just sort of watch that happen and not try and do anything just sort of felt morally untenable. So again, we make lots of mistakes and didn't do everything perfectly, but sort of putting real money behind the school improvement grant program and really trying to challenge the status quo, put resources behind those, whether it's more time or more counselors or more social workers, but saying that, I always say systems are generally designed perfectly to produce the outcomes they get. And when you have a dropout factory, unfortunately, they are largely designed pretty perfectly to produce more dropouts. And so unless you do something differently, again, we're just giving young people no chance at all. So having your guys, having the local data in Chicago, then having, understanding the national picture, understanding it was an urban problem, a rural problem, and a suburban problem. No one had a monopoly on dropout factories, and trying to, put some resources behind, but also handle some controversy of people fussing about, calling it out. Honestly, didn't lose much sleep over that. And, not every school turned around, but many of those dropout factories stopped being dropout factories. And that felt good. I wish I wish we had a national goal for continuing to reduce the dropouts. I wish we had a national goal for increasing high school graduation rates. Unfortunately, the current administration is just absent any vision or leadership, but hopefully a new administration can take that mantle and run with it.
Arnie, thanks for your passion and your humility and, continuing the hard, great work through Grad and Emerson Collective in Chicago. Visiting you on the ground there with those young people was just extraordinary to see your work firsthand. Good news is we do still have a national goal. The country does, notwithstanding the absence of the national discussion. But John, what are your thoughts?
Well, as always, it's difficult to follow Margaret and Arnie, right? I agree with everything that they said and appreciate, Bridge, your leadership on this and Bob's and the hard work of principals and teachers and community-based organizations to get us to where we are. I think two lessons I would draw. One is it is clear that relationships matter hugely. I mean, we heard that on the student panel just now, right? As Jack and Ash talked about their experience, we've got to make sure that every young person feels connected to an adult. And whether that's through City Year or through the kinds of work that Building Assets and Reducing Risks is doing, what we see in the schools that have closed graduation rate gaps, that have reconnected students, is they are betting on relationships. The other lesson, I think, and again, we heard this, I think, from Jack and Ash, is that student engagement matters a lot. Kids, I was a high school teacher, and when I think about high school kids, one of the big challenges is making sure they see a reason to be engaged with school. And for some kids, that's the arts. For some kids, that's dual enrollment and knowing that they're earning college credits. For other kids, it's a career and tech ed program, but every kid needs some hook, something that makes them excited about, passionate about their school experience so that they show up every day and get through to graduation. As we pivot to the next part of the conversation, I guess one observation is we still have very troubling gaps based on race. We still have very troubling gaps for students with disabilities. We still have very troubling gaps for English learners. And we still see that the most vulnerable students are often among those who don't finish high school. Students who are homeless, students who are struggling with food insecurity, students who are involved in the juvenile justice system, students who are in foster care. So at this point, to keep making progress, we've really got to intensify the resources that we provide, not only in schools, but around schools to try to address some of the things that are getting in the way for kids.
Thank you, John, and thanks, to you for the great work you're doing at Ed Trust now. And Margaret, Texas 2036, you've gone from being Secretary of Education to these extraordinary platforms. Even the dog in the background doesn't like those worrisome educational inequities. And so, we're also worried about the ongoing and long-term consequences of the pandemic and, the eruption appropriately of protests in response to systemic racism, particularly these educational gaps with young people of color, low-income students, English learners, students with disabilities, students experiencing homelessness. So how do we actually ensure during this difficult time that the system really does meet the moment, responds to this current moment without backsliding on these incredibly hard-fought wins, including maintaining accountability and quality? So Arnie, we started with Margaret first. Why don't we start with you?
And everybody may not agree with what I have to say here, but systemic racism is part of every structure, every fabric in our society, part of our justice system, part of our healthcare system, part of our housing system, part of our access to food system, and it is absolutely part of our education system. Education is not exempt from that. And very honestly, John, I think far too often we have lacked the courage to really take that on. And so let me just give you a couple things that if we're serious, not about talking about it, not about issuing statements, not about just demonstrating empathy, not about checking on people, but actually doing some work, there are a couple things we would do very, very differently. One, John talked about relationships. Great teachers matter. Great teachers matter tremendously. Great principals matter tremendously. We're big on local control in the United States. I understand that. We have 15,000 school districts. John, I don't know of a single district, not one in 15,000, that systemically identifies their most successful, most committed teachers and principals and puts them with the kids that need the most help, the kids that John's talking about. Don't know one that does that. And if we believe great talent matters, if we believe great teachers matter, if we were serious, we would identify that talent and put that talent where it needs to go. Secondly, if we're trying to close gaps, stop systemic racism, we have to think very differently about the allocation of time. And 6 hours of school a day, 7 hours a day might work for a lot of kids, might work for John's kids, might work for my kids, but some kids might need 12 hours a day of school. Some might need 14. Some might need boarding school because home isn't safe. I often think about what works for the wealthy in America probably works pretty well for the poor. And I went to college and met all these people who'd been to boarding schools. I didn't really know what a boarding school was. It worked very well for the wealthy. But some kids need 3 meals a day. And are we willing to do those things? Again, not have a cookie cutter approach, but are we willing to provide more time, more after school, more of the extracurriculars that John talked about, art, band, robotics, whatever, United Nations, Model UN, whatever it might be. Are we going to do that? And then the final one that the pandemic has really revealed is the digital divide. Can we give an access to a device, to Wi-Fi, so that children any place, anytime, anywhere can learn what they want to learn. So those, for me, it's the 3 T's. It's talent, it's time, and technology. And if we are serious, we will do some things very differently. If we're not serious, we'll continue to talk about the problem. We'll continue to admire the problem, but not have the kind of systemic impact that I think our kids need and our country needs.
Love the 3 T's. Thank you, Arnie. And John, could you reflect on the question too? And also this question I get a lot around the country in terms of, are we making enough progress among leaders of color and teachers of color and people in school systems, that can relate to all kids? Thoughts?
Oh, that's it. Your point is exactly right. I mean, I think Arnie captured many of the things that we need to do. Many of them cost money. We're in a moment when states and school districts are looking at big holes because of the COVID economic crisis. So it's worth saying one thing we desperately need is for Congress and the federal government to step up with additional resources to close the gaps that we're seeing and to invest in things like broadband access. But to your point about teachers, majority of kids in the nation's public schools today are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. Only 2% of our teachers are African-American men. And we know from research that for a Black elementary school student, having just one Black teacher increases their likelihood of graduating from high school and going on to college. So one of the ways we ought to tackle our goal of raising graduation rates is we ought to work harder to diversify the teaching profession. That means we've got to invest in HBCUs and minority serving institutions. We have to build grow your own programs that start as early as high school. We need better partnerships between community colleges and four-year institutions to diversify the pipeline of teachers. We also need more bilingual teachers. Again, English learners, particularly students who arrived during their middle school and high school years, are a big factor in the continued dropout rate. Those are students we have got to find a way to reach. And one of the ways to do that is to have bilingual teachers who can make sure they're making progress in their core courses, even as they're learning English, and so that they can build relationships with those teachers, and so they can become bilingual themselves, and so that their families have someone when they call the school that they can talk with about their experience. So the work on the teacher diversity issue is deeply connected to this work on improving graduation rates.
It's fantastic, John. Margaret, from the beginning, you always said, Bridgie, it's all about accountability. And I know accountability is tough, but a March 2020 Brookings study showed, the question is, the rise in graduation rates real? And it concluded that graduation rate accountability drove rising graduation rates. And then on the question of quality, it said, and Bob and I verified this in the data, the rise in high school completion came with a reduction in GEDs and a shift to a more rigorous regular diploma. And so they concluded the national rise in high school graduation rates has been a significant success for school accountability policy and the school systems generally. So one, I wanted to say, way to go. And then secondly, any thoughts on, in this really trying time, how do we think about accountability, and how do we think about, preserving these gains and supporting students with all the relationships John and Arnie have talked about?
Right, and I want to, enthusiastically agree with my colleagues and pivot that, because Arnie used the words "if we're serious." Well, the "if we're serious" translates to holding ourselves accountable, to caring enough to find out, to measure, especially now. And one of the things that I think is so critical that we as leaders in an organization like yours, Bridge, is to frame what the stakes are with the kind of learning loss we're seeing. You talk about left behind, baby. This is, on steroids. And so the consequences for these individuals, for our nation, trillions of dollars of lost income, lack of prosperity. I mean, it just the road to nowhere that will, if we don't pull up, intervene, warp speed, whatever you want to call it, right now, we will pay, for these dire consequences for decades to come. And so I think, framing this in ways the public understands, federal leadership would be nice around this, but, we're doing the best we can out here to talk about that, and certainly at the state level. And then investing in this time. We've also done some work in Texas, and I'm sure it holds out, when we reduce resources, we retreat on achievement too. So it is, as I used to say, reform plus resources equals results. And that's, as true as ever. So, we cannot, here's the other thing. We cannot be a half-empty kind of advocacy crowd. We got to be, this is a doable deal. And we can and we must really intervene, provide the resources, or we'll pay for decades to come.
Yeah, I can't help but think it'd be nice to have the three of you continually involved in federal education policy as we move to the next wave. I don't know if we have the structures for that, but
we're part of the deep state.
So, it's interesting. A friend of mine sent a book to me the other day, Ted Dintersmith, called What School Could Be. And a lot of people around the country are saying, isn't this the time to kind of totally re-envision our education system and our pipeline to work, and also our pipeline to civic life? And I know, Arnie, at Emerson, there's the XQ Institute, and there are many efforts around the country. They're doing such innovative work. What are the one or two biggest transformations you'd like to see, emerging from this that would enable all students, including especially historically underserved students, to graduate high school, be ready for college or something beyond high school, the future of work, and also be active citizens, not spectators, in the lives of their democracy and country? John, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, Bob referenced one of the things, which is we need to deploy a lot more talent in this area. And one way to do that would be radically expanding AmeriCorps, right? And Senator Coons has a bipartisan proposal to do exactly that. If we had more young people, recent college graduates, recent high school graduates who were playing a role, whether it was through City Year or other similar programs, helping to build kids' sense of connectedness, that would make a huge difference. And so we ought to do that. Two, we have to invest more in our highest needs students. There was a study that EdBill did that showed there's a $23 billion gap in the resources that we allocate to white students versus students of color. We've shown at EdTrust a $2,000 per pupil difference in what we spend in the districts that serve the most white students compared to the districts that serve the largest numbers of students of color. We just underinvest in the students who need additional support. Now I agree with Margaret. We need to tie those additional resources to reforms, to equity-focused, accountable reforms. But we do need more resources. And if we were to have a more equitable distribution of resources, we'd be in a much better position to close some of these gaps.
Nice. So big expansion of national service. I like the sound of that. Margaret, what do you think? What would you like to see that's not, is present today?
Well, I think, again, organizations like yours and people like us, we've got to stay focused on results. And there is going to be a tidal wave of pushback against assessment and accountability. I think, obviously, we got to think about those two issues as separate. We've conflated those a lot, but we have to measure and find out and diagnose, or else, when there's no problem, there's no solution, and there's no resources. And so I'm very worried that there'll be this headwind around those issues. And secondly, I think one of the things that I'm excited about is, and it ties right into what Bob was saying as well, it is a tutoring core, this connectedness with an adult that is it designed in a skilled way to recapture students and get them on track. And wouldn't it be swell if we had a national imperative around that with retired people, with just the harnessing the talent we have in this country around this moral imperative for our country is something that I would really love to see.
That's one specific thing that's going to come out of this panel. We're all going to work together on a national tutoring corps.
Amen.
Volunteer, AARP, seniors, older Americans, national service, city year, communities and schools. We have the capacity. That's something that we really ought to take on. Arnie, what would you add?
Let me go back to two other quick points, and I'll try and answer that directly. One, just on the accountability piece. For me, you always need sort of checks and balances. I think that's what's missing in our democracy right now, is checks and balances. Yeah. So for me, the focus on the high school graduation rate is critically important. But I also think we have to measure sort of college persistence as well. And if you're only measuring one thing, you can create some perverse incentives to push kids through or water things down. And so, yes, we want that high school diploma, but I want to, our young people do they have the skills to be successful at the next level? And so I just want to add that to the mix. Secondly, I just want to, sort of talk about the elephant in the room. You got 3 former Secretaries of Education and no one from the current administration here. And it's fascinating. I used to reach out to Margaret, used to reach out to Secretary Page, Secretary Riley, pick their brains on stuff. And just to be dead, I've never heard not once from the current administration, just zero interest. And again, not that any of us have all the answers, but even just to hear all the things we did wrong and made mistakes on would be beneficial, again, if there's a seriousness. And that's the lack of that is, I think, pretty devastating for kids. To build upon what you guys are saying, this national service for me isn't just for kids. It's about rebuilding our democracy and mixing up people from different backgrounds, having them work together, try and build some trust, try and build some relationships, city kids with rural kids, white kids with Latino kids, with Black kids, with Native American kids. And absent that, I worry about our democracy continuing to fray in some extraordinarily unhealthy ways. And I'm not big about sort of singing Kumbaya around a campfire. I am big at doing some work together, rolling up our sleeves, and getting programs like City Year that are sending a diverse set of folks into schools are huge. So just multiple benefits for kids, for education, but I would argue for our country and for our democracy with that. The other piece I would just add is, particularly just given all the work I'm doing now, I can't overstate the level of trauma that young people are dealing with. Nobody wakes up and says, I want to be a high school dropout. That's no one's ambition. It's always a symptom of something much, much deeper going on at school, at home, in the community, or all three. And we simply can't do enough to help young people heal, give them the support they need to work through trauma. That was true pre-COVID. We obviously have so many more families now whose total lives have been turned upside down. And so for me, that's the sort of the social and emotional needs, feeding kids. That's the foundational stuff. Then we can talk about high academic standards, but we got to really do that and identify those kids that are just dealing with things that are almost unimaginable, and just help them through that process so they can think about, AP biology and chemistry and physics.
Love what all of you have said. And I was thinking about, healing a divided nation. How do we get out of this polarization that's just so severe, and the threats to our institutions of democracy? And it's General McChrystal, who served 34 years in the military and saw the power of the military to do this mixing that you're talking about, Arnie, people of different backgrounds, races, ethnicities, politics, faiths, and they discovered their leaders, and they discovered they can work together across difference. And that is a big transformational idea. And no lobbying or advocacy on this, but call Speaker Pelosi and the leadership in the House and Senate and support the idea of national service. So Arnie, you mentioned that, the potential, and you're working every day with young people in the most difficult circumstances. And it was the voices and perspectives of young people who really brought this issue to the country. How do we, how do you as policymakers, how does the Department of Education, how do our state houses, how do our schools put the voice and perspective like Jack and Ash and AJ, and then extraordinary teachers like Tyler who support them? How do we put young people at the center of our educational discussion and movement toward reform? Thoughts on that? And I'll just open it up.
Okay, well, I'll be a little bit of a contrarian maybe. I think and of course we should do that, but it's not a substitute for adults leading and coming together and forging consensus and setting goals and, holding ourselves as adults, leading these institutions accountable. And so, yes, we need to listen to students, but, I'm worried that gets translated into letting others off the hook.
Yeah, I would just say this, Margaret, though, it was interesting when we went to Philly and I met this young woman who took over the focus group and she wanted to be an astrophysicist. And 20 minutes later, we learned she was a prostitute on the streets of Philadelphia. And that's what got me into the issue. I thought, how can this lost potential happen? And she talked about how she went in Philadelphia at 16 and literally signed out of school. And it was through that we discovered, oh my God, we got 32 states to raise the compulsory school age law to 18. I'm just a simple fix that was stupid and from past generations. And it was about expectations, which you talk so compellingly about. So the point a little bit is, are there ways and means by which we can learn things, social and emotional development from young people, or restorative justice, not just suspending them or expelling them or bringing them into their own problem solving, those kinds of things. And how do we do that more effectively? I don't know, John or Arnie, you have thoughts?
That's one thing we have to do is we have to talk to kids and listen to their insights. I have my focus group here at home with my 9th and 12th grader. They have very strong views on many subjects that are very well informed. They're often right.
Yeah.
And we did 2 papers recently at Ed Trust, one on girls of color and discipline in schools. African American girls are suspended at 5 times the rate as white female students. Actually, it's a story in the New York Times today on the discipline disparities for girls of color. And when you talk to girls about their experience, they will describe how they are treated differently based on race, how the dress code is enforced differently, how there are assumptions made about their tone, about their language, and all they want is the opportunity to be successful in school and to be treated with respect and caring by the adults in school. We did another paper on socio-emotional learning and the need to center issues of racial equity. And for that paper, we interviewed kids and parents. And one of the things we heard is a struggle with socio-emotional learning because people were saying, I get that that's what the school says they want to do, but then in our curriculum, we never see ourselves reflected. We never read books by authors of color. We never read novels that center characters of color. We don't learn about the contributions of people of color in our history. So, 45 minutes of mindfulness doesn't make up for not seeing myself reflected in the school's curriculum. So I do think there's an opportunity to learn a lot from listening to kids because they're our customers and they're experiencing school every day. Yeah, very good. Arnie, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I got a million crazy stories. I'll just try and tell one very quickly that, most of the guys I work with, most of the men in our program dropped out of high school, and every story is different. And many of my staff dropped out of high school, and I'll just tell you one of our staff, one of my best teammates now. I asked him why he dropped out. He was a 9th grader, and he had to for gym class you had to change into your gym uniform, but because his home situation was so difficult, he had sores all over his body, and he was ashamed of the sores on his body, so he wouldn't change. And so no one asked him why he wouldn't change his clothes. He was seen as defiant, and he basically failed gym. And that started down a road of dropping out of high school. And that young man, unfortunately, went on to commit homicide, to kill somebody. Had someone asked him, you're a good kid, you're a smart kid, what's going on with, he's actually an athlete. What is it about changing clothes that's difficult? You think about the life that would have been saved. You think about how much, and he's doing amazing work and was now saving lives. But you think about the time he was incarcerated, and it literally all started because nobody asked him the question, why is this hard?
Yeah, Bridge, I'll never forget when Bush was governor, he went to a juvenile justice facility. A kid was locked up there, probably 14-year-old kid. And I remember him asking then Governor Bush, what do you think about me? Have you given up on me? And it was one of those, hang in the air kind of moments.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
To be listened to and claimed and acknowledged. That's why I'm so excited to see social and emotional and academic development just take off in the country in terms of integration. Well, listen, we're going to move to the question period. Before I turn it over to Monica to get questions for the audience, I just want to say, it's a pretty dark time in the life of the country, but leadership really matters. And I love the three of you people and what you've done for our country and what you continue to do for our country. And it's that kind of energy and leadership and smarts and humility that's actually going to matter in bringing us back. So Monica, do we have some questions from the audience?
Yes, Bridge, we absolutely do. I want to just share my gratitude as well to Secretary Spellings, Duncan, and King for your strong sense of urgency and smart, specific calls to action. We do have a few questions. I'm going to start with this first one with Secretary Duncan, but really invite perspectives from all three of you. We got a few questions about how career readiness is treated in the high school years and how that connects to post-secondary. So one question, do you think our efforts on career readiness to date may have taken away our effectiveness in getting more students to want to go and be able to go to college?
Yeah, it's a good question. I fundamentally reject that thinking. Most things in education, people sort of get into these either or debates, charters versus tradition or college versus careers. And I think it's almost always both and. So I think these are false dichotomies. We need a hell of a lot more kids going on to college. We need a hell of a lot more kids who are career ready. And guess what? The skill set for those two things is virtually identical. So I do not see these things in conflict whatsoever. My personal opinion is that we don't do a good enough job on either side, and these are mutually reinforcing. One of those schools that used to be a dropout factory that I visited outside of Boston had an amazing career program. They had all the traditional stuff. They had, auto body shop, wood shop, all those things. They also had a fully functioning veterinary clinic there. They had a fully functioning bank. They had a place where if you were going through chemo, you could go get a wig. In that school that had been sort of the outcast of the community, the school that everyone was scared to go to became the heartbeat, the center of the community. And guess what? Not only did their high school graduation rate go up dramatically, their college going rate went up dramatically. Young people saw the relevance of what they were learning in classes to career skills they were learning, right there in the school with all these amazing partnerships. So for me, it's always both and we have to hold ourselves accountable for doing a much better job of preparing kids for both those things and let them figure out their passion, let them figure out their interests. The final thing I'll say is that the vast majority of people going to college now, they're working and going to school. It's not work or school, it's both. Again, it's both and at that level. And so giving people the chance to, again, find their passion, find their interests, be exposed to a whole range of things, I would argue not just in high school, but in middle school is so critically important. So many of the young men I work with now, they just had no idea about the world of work. There's just no one they knew who was in the world of work. You can't just preach that. You got to give exposure. You got to give opportunities for internships, for guest speakers, for career days. We got to do a whole lot more of all that stuff.
Monica, Bob Balfanz said it a bit ago. This idea that what a kid knows or a student knows coming out of high school and the nexus with that and being admitted to post-secondary education and even the flagships. So we've got this disconnect right now. And I would say, in Texas, we have high graduation rates, but, when you turn these policy dials, we want to make sure that we're not turning down the quality to ratchet up the throughput, if you will. And so making sure those connections, and that's where the business community and others who are paying attention, we need to engage the business community much more vigorously than we have.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate those insights. So here's another question for all, and we could start with Secretary Spellings. It's essentially a question about how the federal education reform bills of the last 20 years, if you have reflections on them. So the question is this: how do we tie resources to reform without repeating the problems we had with No Child Left Behind? And related question, what do you all think, or do you all think ESSA is doing what it was designed to do?
The reason for the federal role in education is civil rights, is to try to elevate the needs of all students and to resource those students in particular, and to provide federal leadership, equity, a lens on that. And that was the theory of action from day one. And so I personally believe that has drifted. People are not looking to the federal government for that sort of leadership, and we need to restore that, because it's important. If I had a nickel for every school superintendent who kind of in a sideways way would say, thank God for No Child Left Behind, because I could have never had stood for, putting out disaggregated data and trying to resource disadvantaged students in more productive ways and so on. So you need that. You need that leadership. You need the transparency. And sure, we made mistakes. Absolutely. We, I think, failed to engender enough parent and teacher support. They didn't see the value for themselves quickly enough. But there is no doubt whatsoever that students in this country have benefited from a focus on their achievement and the elevation of that year over year, including on graduation.
I agree with Margaret. I would just add, I think assessment and accountability are necessary but not sufficient for progress. And one of the things that has to go with accountability is the development of the capacity of the system to improve. And I think we have not, over the last 2 decades, put enough into the capacity building. You think about the schools where students are struggling in reading. We have a whole body of evidence around the science of reading, and yet we are not using that science of reading to ensure that students become capable readers, right? And that's K-12 practices, that's teacher prep practices, that's professional development practices, but we need to invest in those capacity building efforts. The other point I'd make, and this is a harder one politically, but I think crucial, we're more than 60 years past Brown versus Board of Education, and we have not, as a country, seriously tried to deliver on the vision of Brown since really the 80s. In the 80s, we sort of gave up on school integration efforts, and it was a mix of policy decisions and judicial appointments, but where we ended up was really a slowing of efforts to integrate schools. And now today we have places around the country that are more segregated by race and class than they were even 10 years ago. And the sad truth is that resources follow white and affluent students. And so to the extent that we systematically isolate low-income students of color in a subset of schools, our politics work such that those schools often are deeply under-resourced. And we have to take that on. And there are lots of places around the country that if they practice smarter policies around school assignment, around the design of district lines, they could actually achieve greater integration. And that would also, I think, strengthen our democracy as well, because young people would be better prepared to operate in a diverse world as adults.
Thank you. I want to close with one question, and I welcome thoughts from each of you, whoever wants to jump first. We heard a lot from the young people earlier and in your discussion with Bridge about social and emotional learning. but we're hearing some feedback. There's been a lot of chatter about this in the chat as well, about the importance of it and how young people in poorly resourced neighborhoods and schools would benefit from it in particular. But without an official national focus on social and emotional learning, what can be done to ensure that those aspects of learning are part of young people's education?
Well, it can absolutely be a state focus. There's no law against that. I spoke with our commissioner this morning, and they've about a month ago put out some resources around that, trying to educate teachers about, yes, about their own students' mental health and what to look for, but also about teachers themselves. I mean, these are trying times for all of us, and I can't, you know, just the what we are asking of our teachers these days is just Herculean. And so I think state resources can be brought to bear. I mean, I'm, you know, giving up on Washington at the moment, but I'm seeing some encouraging signs of that sort of thing happening around the country.
Just say progress on SEL requires thinking in systems, not sort of deficit frame on kids. It worries me sometimes that SEL is pitched as like fixing kids, often fixing kids of color, fixing low-income kids. To me, it's a question of how do we support the socio-emotional development and well-being of all our kids, and that's a systems question. We can't have overuse of exclusionary discipline. We can't have a curriculum that doesn't provide windows and mirrors for students. We can't have a non-diverse staff and say we care about SEL. Those are SEL issues too. So we have to prepare teachers to do relationship building, to attend to kids' socio-emotional development, but we have to build systems that support that development. And white kids need SEL too. When I think about those young white people marching across the campus of UVA in Charlottesville, chanting racist slogans, like that's a failure of SEL, right? So we have to own that SEL is not for some kids. We have to care about all kids' development as social beings, their ability to see the world through the perspective of others, their ability to have empathy. That needs to be developed everywhere.
I'll just quickly add and sort of put SEL in a little bit broader context. So what's the federal role? Margaret talked, and we all 100% agree that the role of the federal government is really fighting for equity, you know, fighting for the disadvantaged, fighting for the vulnerable, fighting for the marginalized, and that's always the heart of it. I would add, for me, there are two more legs of what the federal government should be doing. One is fighting for excellence as well, and that's the kind, you know, high standards and things that give kids a chance to be successful. But the third leg of that stool for me is innovation. And one of the things that I'm really proud that we were able to do was the Invest in Innovation Fund, the I3 fund that Jim Shelton ran, that was not based upon any theory I had or any idea I had or President Obama had. Just show us evidence of what's making a difference in your community, and show us a lot of evidence, and we're going to give you a lot of money at $50 million. Show us some evidence, we'll give you, you know, $15, $20 million. Show us a little evidence, we'll give you $5 million, and give you a chance to scale what's working. And when you talk about, you know, reducing dropout rates, increasing high school graduation rates, I don't think anybody can do that without a focus on SEL. I just don't think it's possible. And so just having, again, nothing partisan, nothing whatever, just show us your data of what you're doing. For all the horrific problems in education, they are being solved somewhere every single day. And we all had the privilege of seeing both the failures, but also amazing success stories. What we don't do in education is scale. And that's hard to do at the local level. It's hard to do at the state level. I think the federal government could do a much better job of really, you know, funding that. We funded, you know, a tiny percent of the I think we funded like 9% of the amazing ideas we got, because that was all the money we had. And then that pot of money went away. So just, I remember, you know, a group of schools in Appalachia, they're doing an unbelievable job of reducing dropout rates, primarily white kids, poor rural white kids in Appalachia, and help those districts really scale and do that. And that felt fantastic to be able to work on that. So that, I think, if the federal government were to own sort of supporting that local innovation, that local success, I think that'd be unbelievably helpful for the country.
Well, that's an incredible note to end on. I just want to, again, extend huge gratitude to the three of you and to Bridge for the amazing dialogue, and to the young people we heard from earlier. For us to meet the moment and close the national gap between 85 and 90%, we must focus resources and our energies and our best innovative thinking on working with and for Black and Brown young people with disabilities, English learners, and young people in low-income areas. We have to be much more mindful as well, harkening back to what Bob said about different kinds of school, alternative schools and online schools, who are increasingly part of what we need to focus on as a campaign. So as we move to close today's session, I just want to again say huge gratitude to everyone who spoke and shared their wisdom with all of us. I want to encourage everyone in the audience and who listens to this recording to review the data in this year's Building a GradNation report for your state and consider how your own views on fairness, opportunity, and young people's lives match with the outcomes you see for your state. Progress depends on each of us individually and us as a collective in realizing that my kid's education shouldn't be any different than any other kid's. And the Meet the Moment plan that was shared today reflects that value. So again, I want to thank all of you for being here with us and want to invite you, if you're able, to stay with us for what we're calling After the Show. We got a lot of good questions, a lot of chatter during today's session. It was a lot of furious work by an incredible team behind the scenes to kind of corral some good content for after the session. So if you can stay, we invite you to stay. And we have some questions for Bob and Bridge and others. But if you're not able to, also really appreciate that. So I'll just say thank you and be well. And we're going to move into after the session.
Thank you all. Good to see you, John. Miss you guys.
Good to see you, Arnie. Thanks,
Bye.
Bridge.
Thanks, guys.
Bye. Thanks, Bridge.
Thank you, guys.
All right, so I think the audience will sort of just make its decision about where to go from here. We're calling this After the Show, so we have some questions in the pipeline for our young people and for Bridge and Bob as two authors of the report. So I want to start with a question for Bob, going back to the beginning when you were talking about the Meet the Moment plan. What is the plan? Is there a plan for providing extra training for AmeriCorps volunteers to take on the roles you described?
So the Meeting the Moment plan is what we're sort of putting forth and launching today and building the GradNation coalition around. But the specific question of support for AmeriCorps was, as Secretary Duncan measured, and like John King also, there currently are bills in Congress and the Senate, which would both expand AmeriCorps and increase training and supports, and in particular are designed to create the type of student success coaches we talked about and to scale them and to increase the ability for schools to draw upon them.
And I would just want to add, Monica, that thanks to AT&T, part of the plan or the job plan, but then the pandemic came on the scene, and we felt like that was not humble enough given the circumstances. And AT&T stepped up and has been providing support to city and communities and schools and all these community-based nonprofits that are deploying National Service Corps members or other supports. And on a personal note, my own son is doing a year of national service through City Year San Jose, and I'm getting these daily reports on just the critical need for wraparound supports for students, and then what he and the teacher and the Corps members are able to do together to meet these needs. So it's really a stunning idea to have a national tutor corps in the United States, and it sounds like we have 3 former Secretaries of Education strongly behind it.
Great, thank you. Another question came in around the role of SEL and what recommendations you might have for state policymakers who want to track their progress on supporting whole child policies, which include SEL. So this is a question about measurement. If they are wanting to practice evidence-informed decision-making, what metrics should they track?
I'll begin by just saying, one of the innovative things that's happened in the country out of this 20-plus year effort of the CASEL is something called the Collaborating States Initiative, where I think they have more than 30 states who've made common cause around how do we systemically integrate social, emotional, and academic development in our schools and our districts, and how can state policy support that effort. And across those states, they've been sharing lots of innovations about how do we actually measure changes in behavior, changes in empathy, changes in time management, changes in collaboration and problem solving. And what are the innovative ways in which to ensure that, the same kind of clarity and measurement and achievement we have around academic indicators, we also try to bring to social and emotional indicators. And then, of course, the effort to get states to put in place standards or competencies that make it a state priority for social and emotional development is critical. And states like Kansas, that had a little pushback on standards, said, well, we're going to do the Kansas CANS standards and connect SEL to workplace competencies, and it took off like a rocket. So there are many innovative ways to do it. I don't know, Bob, what would you add?
Just the one thing I would add is that there's a very powerful body of literature called School Connectedness, which actually came out of the Center for Disease Control initially, of all places. And it basically says kids are connected to school when 4 things are true, which are actually, I'm going to say these things quickly, but all these things are measurable. When they have 2 or more adults that care and know about them as a person, that's a checklist. That they have access to and are part of a supportive peer group. That's a survey question to kids. Do you have peers you connect with who support you? They're involved in pro-social activities. Like, we forget this one so much. Kids want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. They want to be involved in fighting for social justice. They want to be involved in tutoring younger kids. They want to be involved, and that's measurable. And finally, that they believe school is a welcoming place. That they believe that school wants them there and they're a part of it. And that can be measured both by the fact that we're not suspending kids, that we have restorative justice practices, and again, by surveying. So there are ways to combine surveys and checklists to really measure the core elements that matter about sort of, is SEL, or do kids feel a part of SEL that says, I'm connected to school?
And if people are looking for more information, they can go on the CASEL website or contact Roger Weisberg at CASEL, and he's got a whole portfolio of good resources.
Great. I have a question that came in, and I'm just going off of the question to think that Bob and maybe Ty can answer. The question is just around in the field. The challenges seem to be in accessing young people who live in environments that maybe they don't have regular supervision or support at home, and social distancing doesn't allow for traditional school adults to enter the home to provide supports, and that the disparity is often in communities of color. So are either of you aware of how other schools or districts are handling these kinds of challenges as it relates to the home school connection?
Well, I mean, one way I might reframe that we know is a challenge is there was significant numbers of kids who sort of disappeared, right? That were not able to participate in the spring, maybe didn't have the right devices or the connections, maybe had to work, maybe had to support siblings learning, and have not reconnected as schooling again started remotely, right? People were hoping, at least if it started in person a little bit, you could have a reconnection. The folks that have been able to do best against that, and it's a tough problem, have sort of really asked themselves, well, if we don't know where they are, who might know where they are? Sort of working their social networks, right? Thinking about who their friends might be, what adult they might have connections to, and working through that chain of who knows who knows who, to find a way to sort of reestablish connection.
Absolutely, that's a problem, an issue that we're facing in Wake County as connecting with students. And oftentimes, our students, because of the pandemic, have taken on, they're now the breadwinners for their families and have taken on roles that we would not traditionally see 16, 17, or even 14-year-olds taking on. And so there's a lot of grace and flexibility that we have been providing to students regarding that, trying to address those issues. And one thing is our attendance policy has changed in Wake County. As of, if a student doesn't necessarily attend your class, but they contact you, whether it's an email, a remind message, they're counted present, and then we can try to bridge that gap. And also finding ways, we have 2.5 hours daily of office hours where our students can pop in and get that one-on-one that they need. And oftentimes it works. And oftentimes, what we're seeing in this remote learning is that students who would struggle in the classroom are actually doing well by keeping up and using tools that are helping them be successful. From a special education perspective, I'm seeing students that struggled before COVID actually, passing and thriving in this setting. And so it's finding ways that works for our students and meeting them where they are to help push them along. And again, this is just trial and error. We're just all taking this day by day and week by week and really just seeing what works. And the great thing is our students, I think what I'm finding to be my success is before COVID, I had already tried to build relationships with students. And I think building those intentional relationships with students can help address these gaps that we're seeing because students really want to see that their teachers care for them. And I think that we have seen across this nation and whatnot, teachers stepping up and answering the calls and being the superheroes that we all knew that teachers are. So.
Well, you're a teacher, Ty, and I think you're a superhero this year because that's just the way the year is happening. Appreciate those insights. I want to pose this question to close, and I would love to start with Jack and Ash, particularly since you're in the school environments right now. What are the critical skills young people need when they graduate?
Yeah, this is a tough question. I think that it's really hard, especially some kids, they don't know what the career field looks like, which is tricky in of itself. If you don't have experience or you don't know what you need to be doing to prepare for the career that you plan on entering, it can be challenging. I know for myself, like I plan on going to law school and like going into law, at least for right now. I mean, I could probably watch Grey's Anatomy and think I want to be a doctor or something later, but right now I work at a law firm. I'm a legal assistant, so like I get that opportunity to see all of the skills that I need to go into that field. But I think generally, I think that it's really important for students to be able to like connect with their peers and being able to work with other people, because I think, well, I mean, that's what I've been taught is that, I'll have to work with people for the rest of my life. So we might as well make it work or figure out how it'll work. And yeah, it's hard. I'm no expert in this field, so it's a little tricky, but that's at least what I think. What about you, Ash?
I am now in college, and so now I get to kind of feel what skills I need to grow in as a student in college, but also as a new inhabitant of COVID learning. And I believe some of the mindsets to thrive in college and post-secondary education are mindsets that are created in the classroom, like a learning mindset, resilience, asking for help. And these aren't things that you learn in chemistry 101 or English 101. These are really set in young educational systems. And I'm blessed to have that type of like teaching style at a young age, even when it comes to like my real life experience, like learning how to ask for help because I didn't know how to pay rent as a homeless student, or learning to be resilient because I didn't know how to provide food for myself when I was starving. And there's like these certain things that you learn from the real world, but it shouldn't be an expectation to learn from struggle. It should be in the classroom where there's no fear of failure, of starving, of not paying rent, of being isolated. And so I think those type of skills should be in the classroom, like finding peers, asking for help, truly connecting with individuals to be a community. And so that's my perspective on that.
Yeah, if I can add just one thing really quickly, that I totally agree with Ash, and that, in Eye to Eye specifically, we talk a lot about grit and like, self-advocacy, setting goals, And those are things that everybody can apply to every aspect of their life. I mean, you know, but if it's me, like my end goal, my long-term goal, being able to set that as like, I want to end up at law school or something. But then a short-term goal is like, you know, I want to finish this essay this week that I have due. So, and goal setting is so, like, those are things that I think are important. And also being able to make those connections with your peers and your teachers especially, because, you know, I know from personal experience, I find great value in connecting with somebody who's teaching me and, you know, being able to talk to my teacher about the things that might be going on in my life, or, you know, it prompts engagement amongst, in all aspects, especially in learning. And I think that all of those skills, if they're fostered in high school and secondary education, will just, you know, make everybody flourish in their careers and stuff, so.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Ash and Jack. I want to see if Bridge or Bob have any final thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I just love listening to Jack and Ash and Tyler. I could do that all day. But I would say, you know, I think it was Tony Carnefali who said the purpose of education is to live well in and position students to live well in and advance our times. I thought that was so wonderful. And my dad, who grew up in poverty, had a library of 12,000 books. And I said, Dad, why are you doing this? And he said, these are my 12,000 friends. You know, Shakespeare and Hemingway and Arnold, and went through them all, and he'd read them all. And I, in addition to workplace skills, in addition to learning the habits of, you know, becoming a citizen in our democracy who's active and engaged, I also think in an age of anxiety and depression that learning fundamentally what it means to be a good human being and to connect to the lessons. And, you know, when you're having difficulty, you think of Aeschylus, you know, he who learns must suffer. And even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart. You know, you have these things you can draw on and access through literature and philosophy and the humanities that I just think are so fundamentally important to a complete and happy life. And I guess I want to end with that. And a note of gratitude for my friend Bob Balfanz and you, Monica, and Jack and Ash and Tyler for all you do and the participation today. It's really been enriching.
Yeah. And all I'll add is just summing everything up is that, as Secretary Spellings said, this is all doable, so it's on us to do it.
All right.
You're here. Let's go do it then. Thanks to everyone who stuck around for this after the show session. I hope that you learned something or got inspired. I know I'm inspired by Jack and Ash and Ty in particular. So thanks again, everyone. Be well, and make sure to click on the links and check out the report. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Take care.